At the time, we thought the Great Recession was a once-in-a-generation, hell, maybe once-in-a-century economic disaster.
Young people are faced with challenges unimaginable for generations
Dumb,
past.
crazy, lost,
That's why
lazy,
McLean's
entitled,
and
stupid,
Newsweek
selfish,
seized on
dumb,
the
crazy,
phrase.
lost, ignorant, spoiled, bad, sensitive, snowflake, annoying, fucked, and on and on and on.
Described, according to
And
SUNY
Newsweek
psychologist
seized on
Carlo
the phrase "generation screwed."
I am a millennial, and to be honest, I've done pretty decent for myself. I've created a small but successful business, and over the last few years, I've built a pretty decent life for myself. So I could easily hop on the train that millennials who are struggling just need to work harder and you guys are so lazy. And perhaps I'd get some praise from the alpha male enthusiasts and people who think millennials are one of the most entitled generations ever. And look, don't get me wrong, there are many incredibly successful millennials. That doesn't change the fact that the cards and the odds are stacked in such a way that it makes it way more difficult for a millennial to be just as successful with the same amount of effort compared to previous generations. Some might even argue that millennials are the most financially screwed generation in US history. And in this video, I'm going to explain why maybe, just maybe, that might be the case. So without further ado, as always, my name is Derek and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Let's get started. First and foremost, millennials are by most definitions the group of people born between 1981 and 1996, although there are some variations. Which means when we start this journey in around the year 2000, the oldest millennials are entering early adulthood and the youngest millennials are barely a few years old. Which means the first major financial event that happened once all millennials were born was the dot-com crash of 2001. And this financial crash would be the starting point to a chain of events, crashes, and obstacles that when culminated together lead to where millennials are today, dubbed the unluckiest generation. Now, the 2001 dot-com crash was neither severe nor did it greatly impact millennials directly. In fact, there was a relatively small GDP decline of only 0.6%. And unemployment topped out at barely 5.5%, mild by all definitions. And on top of that, since most millennials at the time were still dependents, that unemployment rate wasn't really felt by them, but it was felt by their parents. And while this crash was mild, the labor market never really had a chance to recover to its pre-recession peak, before being walloped again by a much more severe financial crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, known as the Great Recession. And this major economic crisis, one that would go on to define economic policy and economic prosperity, even to this day, was very much felt by millennials on top of being felt by their parents. You see, in 2008, the oldest millennials were in their late 20s, and the youngest millennials were entering their early teens. And because of this age range dynamic, the entire generation got screwed, with each age group in its own unique way. At the top end, you had millennials who were entering prime home buying age, which means you had some millennials who had just bought a home in a market which, when looking back, would be the peak for many years. And right behind them, you had millennials who were getting ready but hadn't bought a home yet. And right behind that group, you had millennials who were about to graduate college in the years to come. And I'm sure you can start to foreshadow yourself how this would turn out once the Great Recession hit. You see, one of the main catastrophes of the 2008 financial crisis was in real estate. In fact, the Great Recession could easily be called a real estate crisis, as the drivers for this crash came from real estate. Well, technically from the debt sector, in the form of CDOs or collateralized debt obligations. But there are plenty of videos covering that in depth, so before I digress, the point is, the millennials who had been fortunate enough to buy a house right before the crash were now utterly and totally fucked. All in all, real estate values saw a massive 30+% drop. And some states like Nevada experienced 60% declines in real estate values, which means these new homeowners were now severely underwater. And you know what? Maybe just a real estate crash alone may have turned out okay if most people could just ride it out. But the problem? This crash also came with massive and unstoppable unemployment across most sectors. The unemployment rate peaked at a whopping 10%, which is about double what it was in the 2001 dot-com crash. And when you're a new homeowner at prime buying age with no equity yet built up, and then housing values crash stupendously, and then you lose your job, what happens? Foreclosures happen. There was a staggering 81% increase in the foreclosure rate in 2008 when compared to 2006, right before that crash. And naturally, you might be thinking, but one man's suffering is another man's opportunity. So what about all the millennials who hadn't bought a house yet? Couldn't they just now come into the market and get a massive discount, setting themselves up for massive financial success in the years to come? Yes, technically they could, except for the fact that those millennials were just a couple of years behind their older brethren, and they were also dealing with the worst sustained decline in employment since the Great Depression. So they didn't really have a job to have the income to scoop up cheap real estate. But guess who did? Older people and older generations. Now, this isn't a dig at Gen X or the boomers. No, both of those generations have had their own trials and tribulations. And in fact, there's some data to suggest that actually Gen X took the hardest brunt of the 2008 financial crisis. But this is the point. When you look at the jobs which got hit the hardest, it was middle wage jobs. The percentage of mid-wage jobs as a proportion of unemployment grew between 2007 and 2013. In other words, the number of middle wage jobs shrank. And here's the thing. Older generations were already above the middle wage in their careers, or they were in the middle wage. So when this crisis happened, all of those employees moved down the ladder, kicking out the newer employees who happened to be mostly millennials. And in the years to come, these slightly older people and older generations were primed and ready to buy up real estate in the years following the crash, which when you look back at now has worked out fantastically well. And again, this is not a dig at older generations. It's just timing. Everyone plays the hand that they're given. And any generation would do the same thing if given the opportunity. So the point of this is actually the opposite. It's simply highlighting the fact that older millennials got fucked. Okay, but what about the younger group of millennials? Well, they were either in college or entering college or would soon be entering college. And that means a massive swath of millennials would be finishing college and entering the job market in the years following the crash, which has now come to be known as an incredibly tough job market. All that, and we haven't even gotten to 2020. And that financial mess that we are all still living through. So I guess we should talk about that next. Yikes, 2020 and the subsequent financial lockdown was over 4 years ago at this point. What? Now, I'm sure to you, it probably doesn't feel that way. It feels like yesterday to me sometimes. And here's the thing, 2020 will go down in history as an extremely pivotal point in time. But financially, especially for millennials, it'll go down as another recession. And what's interesting is that while 2020 was a recession, in a sense, it was a planned recession. Almost like a controlled burn is technically a forest fire. The 2020 recession was technically a recession, but it was engineered. And the problem, not just for millennials, but for everyone, is that the tools used to prop up the economy during this time have gone on to absolutely screw everyone. regardless of generation, with the exception of asset holders, and especially with the exception of real estate owners. Now, we'll get to why here in a second, but first, let's touch on where millennials are at this point in time. The oldest millennials in 2020 are about to turn 40, and the youngest millennials are around 25. And almost like clockwork, or like a bad joke, it is now time for the younger millennials to experience what the older millennials went through just one recession ago, a catastrophic real estate market. Except that for this group, it wouldn't be a crash. No, for the younger group of millennials, it would be the exact opposite. A real estate boom like we've never seen before. The Federal Reserve and the US government printed and borrowed billions upon trillions of dollars in the wake of 2020 to prop up the market, they said. And at first, it did just that, in the form of paycheck protection programs, grants, loans, and direct cash stimulus. The government did keep the economy from totally collapsing. And at first, it seemed to work brilliantly. And then, like a beast waiting in the shadows, consequences. Consequences of our actions. Of our leaders' actions. Except those consequences, as per usual, do not burden our leaders like they rightfully should. No, instead they burden middle-class America. Again, as per usual. And the form of consequence this time around? Inflation. And not just a little inflation, but extremely high inflation, at least by US standards. And while officially that number peaked at a whopping 9%, in 2022, I'm sure a lot of you would attest to the fact that it definitely felt like more. And while that was felt everywhere, it was and still is felt incredibly so in the real estate market. Years of pent-up demand from lockdown, years of supply chain issues, and years of work from home created massive demand and a shortage of supply, which of course led to inflation. And this was aggravated greatly by the trillions of dollars that was pumped into the economy. And when it comes to real estate, the desire for more space because more people were working from home made more and more of those people enter the market, which increased prices since 2020 by 50%. That means your median home price of a little over $250,000 in 2019 is now a whopping $425,000. Almost a $500,000 home is now the average home. And while that was bad enough, it was again the Federal Reserve who brought more pain. This time in the form of higher interest rates, precisely to fight that higher inflation. And what did those interest rates do to mortgages? They made them skyrocket. So much so that now the required income to buy the median priced home in this country is over $105,000, when just a few years ago in 2019, it was a little under 60 grand. And that second, younger group of millennials, again, like a bad joke, were probably just a smidge too young and too early in their careers to be making enough salary to buy those houses before 2020 threw their lives and everyone else's lives back into the fire. And now those millennials and everyone else who couldn't or didn't buy a home, well, they're stuck with home prices that severely outpace the required salary to be able to buy them. Yet prices remain high and keep inching higher. Why? Well, because there's too little supply. Both because the housing market is underbuilt by at least a couple million homes, and because there is such a high percentage of homeowners who are usually older than millennials. That's just the truth. Because there's such a high percentage of these homeowners who have a sub 3% mortgage and who bought their homes for significantly less. And they don't want to, or they cannot afford to sell their home right now to go out and buy a home that's more expensive, that's probably going to be less nice than what they already have. Precisely again because of how expensive the real estate market has gotten. This leads to even further low supply and keeps real estate prices extremely high. And finally, to add insult to injury, it looks like there's a significant chance that we're headed straight for another recession within the next 12 months. Why? Well, because of those high interest rates. They did their job, which was to slow down the economy, because that's kind of like the only way the Federal Reserve knows how to fight inflation. And, well, that strong labor market that everyone's been talking about, which has allowed the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates higher for longer? Yeah, the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, just revised their numbers down by 818,000 jobs, which means over the last 12 months, well, 818,000 jobs that they thought were added to the economy actually weren't. And guess who uses those reports, which looked better than they were, to make policy decisions about interest rates? The Federal Reserve. So now, the chance of recession is back on the table. For reference, Goldman Sachs puts the odds at 25%, which means there's still more of a chance that we don't. But if you're a millennial and you're watching this right now, when has luck ever been on your side? Do you really want to roll that four-sided dice?